are going to try and move off of this slide today. And I even brought my first part of 2 Timothy if we manage to get there, but if not, well, we're prepared anyways. But I thought we'd move on and we'd look at the widows. The deacons pretty much covered a lot of their qualifications with the elders, but I thought too we're going to be doing Titus, the book of Titus again.
Deacons aren't there.
The which?
Deacons aren't there.
They're
not there in Titus, but...
Oh, aren't they?
No.
Oh, okay. That's right, too. Yeah, I was thinking the elders will be seeing again. But the deacons were pretty much, everything was the same, except with the deacons it mentions the wives, and reminding that the wives likewise must be reverent and faithful, not slanderous, temperate, because that's necessary in any case, even with the elders. But why Paul only mentioned the deacons' wives, I'm not sure, but sure.
Also with children, the faithful children isn't the requirement, it's a different phrase on the children, which is why deacons are typically younger than elders are, as their servants.
Right. That's right. It's mentioned ruling their children also. But it all boils down to the fact that these positions, as members, we will look to those men for help, for direction, and for need. So we understand God's wisdom in laying out these qualifications for these men, because it is a position that doesn't leave a lot of room for mistakes. They're directing the flock. They're looking after God's family. So it kind of helps us to realize the reverence that we need to pay them, and also their mindset too. So we move on to 1 Timothy 5, verses 3 to 16. 1 Timothy 5, 3 to 16. I guess we'll read this passage. Maybe we'll take 3 verses each, and we'll start with Jer on this side and work our way back.
Honor widows who are really widows. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. Now she who is really a widow and left alone, trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day.
But she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives, and these things command, that they may be blameless. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever.
The widow is to be put on the list only if she is not less than 60 years old, having been the wife of one man, having a reputation for good works, and if she has brought up children, if she has shown hospitality to strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has assisted those in distress, and if she has devoted herself to every good work.
But refuse the younger widows, when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry, having condemnation because they have cast off their first faith. And besides, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not.
Therefore I desire that the younger widows marry, their children, manage the house, give no opportunity for the adversary to speak reproachfully. For some have already turned aside after seeing. Many believing men or women house widows, let them believe them, and be and not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are willing.
Okay. In this reading here, we find the proper treatment that we are to have towards one another, and the responsibility that we are to have towards those of our families. Before I open up to your thoughts, I'll just say that those that are in true need, okay, are not to be left helpless. That's it. Pretty much the bottom line. Those that are in desperate need should not be left helpless. And so Dave has asked us here then what is taught concerning the following members of the church. And in this passage, we see that special attention is given to the widows. And what pops into your mind at the first? Gord, and then I'll get Jared.
Well, I think the scriptures is separating a widow and a widow in need. Because a widow in need has no support system.
Right.
The widow by herself, if she has family, the family should be helping first instead of burdening the church.
Right. So you're saying
It gives guidelines.
Right. So a widow in need is someone that has no family.
No support.
She's left alone. Jared?
I think this is what we need to realize is a consistent need. Whereas we find in other places that the church helps those who have a temporary need.
Right.
Like as far as they have no support, similar to this widow, and they have a temporary need, lost their homes or something, and the church helps for a time until they get back on their feet. Whereas this widow, who's 60 years old, is unlikely to marry. It's not impossible for a 60-year-old to marry. My grandfather married over that age, but and someone who was that age. But it is very rare for a 60-year-old to marry, and so this is going to be a consistent need.
Right.
And that's why these guidelines are given, is because the church doesn't have endless funds.
Right.
But it needs to help those, as you say, that are in need.
Yeah, exactly. Gord?
There are widows that have no family, but they are wealthy enough to take care of themselves too.
Yeah.
Well, right.
So we have guidelines to help those who are truly in need.
Right. Obviously, then that widow's not in need. One that is financially well off, maybe through business or whatever. But the first thing we notice is that if a widow is left alone, then her children are supposed to look after her. They're commanded, actually, to look after her, to supply her with her means to be fed and sheltered. You think of our parents, on the average, I always think people back, our parents, they were married in their early 20s, and they might have had, maybe if they were lucky, a year or two without children. Then immediately they're in the position of raising children, supplying for the children. All their efforts are devoted to us. We were talking about this couples, Jared and I thought, two people come together and fall in love and get married, and they might get a year to enjoy their company, one another, and then they're having children. And that's a big responsibility, and we need to remember that as children, and they endure financial struggles, mental stress. Really, they give all they had for their children, and as time goes on, even for their grandchildren. So in that case, we owe them. We have a responsibility to them to look after them, don't we?
That's part of the command to honor father and mother. We often
Right.
think, okay, children, these young people, teenagers, well, you need to honor your father and mother. That doesn't change when you move out of the house. Like as far as
No.
my mom's a widow now, she doesn't need all the consistent help that maybe someone would if she was immobile and other things, but we're always checking in on her, making sure she has everything when she's not doing well. That, like as far as my brother lives with her and helps out that way, and so that's part of honoring father and mother.
Right. Everything that we can do, and we are not those of us that are the children. We're not to place our responsibility on the church. That is not. And just having said that, verse 16 shows us the difference between the responsibilities given to the church as a collective body. They are not always the same as the responsibilities given to us. There's differences there, and God shows us that when it comes to our parents, that is our responsibility, not the church's. Colin?
In James, I don't remember where it says, true religion and undefiled before God is visiting the fathers and the widows in their affliction. So that is, you cannot ignore them. That's true religion, what it is all about.
Right. And we see that, don't we, in the world today? Sometimes worldly children just bail out on their parents. They leave them to the government to look after, and that's not right.
And that's what I was going to say, that we should not also, we live in Canada, we are used to a social security system. Social security, when you sit back and take a look at it, provides basic needs, but that doesn't relieve us of the responsibility as children to say, well, the government's doing it, so I don't have to do anything. It's sort of like the Pharisees with their oh, well, we're giving to the temple,
right,
so we don't have to care for father and mother. That's just not true.
Right. And in verse 5 and 6, we see then that who's really a widow. So if they have children, then no, that's not really a widow. That is the children's responsibility. And then in verse 6, we see though the ones that maybe are so well off and live in pleasure of the world, well, they're already dead, is what Paul is having us see. And we are not commanded to aid them in that type of lifestyle.
And younger widows, too.
Oh, we'll get there, yeah.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know you were on that.
Yeah, no, well, I thought we'd get right there. And young widows who are challenged with the loss of a husband are, I don't know if we'd say more heartbroken, but definitely they've married, they've made plans with their husbands, they're looking forward to a life with them, and all of a sudden they're cut short. But Paul says there not to enroll them in the church's list, and he gives some fears, and he gives some directions to those. So in verse 11, why might Paul, do you think, might be telling us to refuse them? Don't put them under the church's responsibility right away. What does he? What is there a fear of? Can you see? Think of what a fear might be of that. I wonder if he's putting them in the thoughts of them being so heartbroken, and if they are being all of a sudden looked after. Okay, maybe will that affect their faithfulness? Will that cause them to their faith lessen? Is the point I'm trying to make? He makes the point here of them in verse 13, being idle, wandering from house to house. Emotionally, that is a great loss, and some of us can become emotionally, we start blaming everything else. It's not our fault. Why did this happen to me? Bad things happen, I understand, but it's how we handle those bad things. And if we allow it, if we allow our emotions to become like that, where, I guess, how could I explain it? Why me? Why me? You know what I mean? And so we start putting our trust in others and not motivating ourselves. Go ahead.
Even though, like, young widows, they're still apt to work.
Right.
Physically, unless they have a physical ailment, they still can provide for themselves to a certain extent. Whereas the elderly ones may not be able to work.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Well,
No, I was
Paul
just
said
clearing my throat.
in verse 14, he assists them in how to handle this. And he's saying that he desires them then to marry, to remarry, to bear children, to all those plans that you had in the first place when you got married before your husband died. Oh yes, you need time to mourn. And if you so choose not to remarry, I don't think Paul's saying that that's wrong, neither. But if you were the type that wanted to be a mother, we know I've known some young ladies that's all they wanted to do. I can't wait to get married and have children. And then if their husband dies all of a sudden, that's pretty shattering. So Paul is saying to them then, take your time to mourn, but then remarry. Fulfill those plans again. Jeff?
Might also be the idea that the younger widow is being taken care of. When we're younger, even if we're not that young, if we have too much time, it's not a good thing for us.
Right.
It simply isn't. When we're younger, we're more active and we need things to set our mind to and do. And if we're being taken care of and seen in the society around us, when you provide free money for young people and who have no direction in their life, it doesn't end up well. So maybe it's just a reminder for young widows, they have a life. They need to apply themselves to whatever roles or responsibilities that God wants them to do. And not to think that, well, I'm a widow now, I will just be taken care of. And I can just basically do whatever comes to mind.
Right. Well, it brings to mind, the thought of companions, bad company, and it's a human weakness. I mean, sometimes we get in the moany attitude, blame everyone else. Why this happened to me? And so if we become overwhelmed with that, and then we find someone else that has that type of nature, then we're in big trouble. Because once we have a partner, a buddy, with that attitude, to try and get out of that, it's hard.
Let's also remember the society that Paul wrote to.
Right.
We come from a 21st century attitude, well, a younger widow can work. Well, the younger widow didn't always have that opportunity to work. That's why Paul's solution was to marry.
Right.
She might have kids. She might have young kids. Her husband might have died when her kids were young. And so now she has to provide for herself and for her children. That was not as easy as can be. Well, I'm not saying it's easy today, but I mean, it's easier because you come along and say, well, she can get a job. That's not always the case in the Roman and Greek societies. Women who did not work, if they could get themselves into prostitution and things like that if they're not working. And so Paul was saying, don't tempt yourself, become busybodies and other things, because you can't work, get married, raise a family, and then when you're older again, then you'll have people to care for you.
Right. Okay, no other comments. Before we move out of this area, I just might sort of reminding us that if we have a younger widow in that position, then maybe we aren't as a church to support them financially, but don't we have a responsibility in helping them mentally, in aiding in another area, past experiences on our part can help someone else. We understand what they're going through. We maybe think of how would we handle that. But as for the whole situation of the widows, I thought of Acts chapter 6. Remember in the very beginning of the church, what was almost the first command to the church as a group, wasn't it, to look after the widows? The deacons were given that responsibility. So it just reminds us that, we need to be on the lookout for one another, to see where we can help and aid those that are in need. Jeff?
Before I move on, there's one other thing we learned from this passage about the church itself, that the individual is different than the church.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Things that the church does not necessarily mean the individual can do it, and things that the individual does not necessarily mean the church can do it.
Right.
Specifically, we say that in verse 4, but especially in verse 16.
Right.
It says, if any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened. So there are things individually we should be doing, the church should not be doing.
Right.
And vice versa. Because some people do get the idea that whatever the church does, I can do it. Or I am the church. I'm not the church.
Right.
We are the church together.
Exactly. Yeah. I thought I mentioned that, verse 16, but maybe not. But yeah, that's a good point. There's responsibilities that we have collectively, and there's responsibilities that we have individually, and they're separated. And that's a good point, because maybe if we're inclined to be greedy or lazy, then I don't want to look after mom. Let the church do that. That's the church's responsibility. Well, we see that it's not. Jeremy gave the case of the Pharisees also. So we'll move on then. No other thoughts. We'll
You
get off.
succeeded.
Eh?
You succeeded. Getting us off that slide.
Yeah, no. And I think we're, organization of the local church, and we're into chapter 5, and verses 17 to 22. And now we want to we've looked at the qualifications of the elders, but so now that we've chosen them, following God's guidelines, how are we supposed to treat them then? Everything, when something's new, I find when something's new, everyone's excited. This is great. We've got to this position. Then as time goes on and then trials arise, problems arise, sometimes attitudes change then. It's just not as exciting. But in chapter 5, 17 to 22. I'll read that, and then we'll discuss that. I might have put the verses for this. Yes. Let the elders who rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in the word and doctrine. For the scripture says, "You shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain, and the laborer is worthy of his wages." Do not receive an accusation against an elder, except on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses. Those who continue in sin, rebuke in the presence of all, so that the rest also may be fearful of sinning. And I charge you, Paul says, before God and the Lord Jesus Christ and the elect angels, that you observe these things without prejudice, doing nothing with partiality. Do not lay hands on anyone hastily, nor share in other people's sins. Keep yourself pure. So what do we see there on how we are to treat the elders then? What jumps out at you? Sure?
First thing is we can support the elders financially.
Right.
That's what that first phrase, they're worthy of double honor.
Right.
They were worthy of honor for being the elder, but they're worthy of double honor because they're laboring in word and doctrine. We often think, well, it's the preacher who's laboring. Well, the elders are too, or at least they're supposed to be.
Right.
Some elders have jobs on their own, and they say, well, no, I'm not going to take a wage. But some will say, all right, this work is so important if they're in a congregation that is large enough, they say, I'm going to leave my job and devote myself wholly to this.
Right.
Then the church can support them.
Yeah. If we're a congregation of 300,
Yeah.
and an elder member is generally someone that's past his youth, so maybe he's retired. And if he's traveling around in a large congregation to different homes, then he's worthy of gas money, of wages, and we are to understand that, not to be greedy and to appreciate what he's doing. That's a good point. Anything else that anyone sees? What about these 2 verses? What do we see there? What can arise if an elder speaks to me and corrects me in something? What might my attitude? What could it be? Not what it should be.
To lash out and accuse the elder of wrongdoing.
Right. Or I could go to another member. Your friend, your best friend, or something, or someone in your family. You can begin to complain about that elder unjustly, trying to seek assurance from someone else, but we're told here not to do that. And if there is an accusation, Paul tells us there needs to be 2 or 3 witnesses then, doesn't there?
Needs to be evidence. It's basically what Paul's saying. It can't just be, I say so.
Right.
2 or 3 witnesses, we often think, well, that's 2 or 3 people. And that's where churches can get into trouble with accusations of sexual assault. Well, who is going to be the second or third witness? Well, there can be proof of it. But
Right.
like as far as we need to be careful as churches, and churches are facing this today, where they're sweeping problems under the rug under something like this. Well, we have to have 2 or 3 people view it. Well, no, it's like I started. That's a callback to the Old Testament for execution. You could not execute someone unless you had 2 or 3 witnesses, unless you had proof. When we go to court, there are witnesses, yes, but there's evidence presented that would prove
Right.
what's being said.
Right.
So we just got to be careful that we're not just accepting as any accusation against an elder, because they're putting themselves in a situation where they can face those things
Right.
because of their job. But if an elder has sinned, like as far as and it has been shown that they have, they're to be rebuked, just like any other Christian.
Right. And even, understanding this part of 2 or 3 witnesses, if you've had a problem with an elder and maybe no one else has seen that, if he has committed a sin against you, maybe no one else has seen that, but then you need to sit down with that elder, and there's usually going to be another elder. We can't have one elder anyway. So then you need to sit down with the eldership and maybe someone else in your family, and then you need to sit down together and bring this problem out in a righteous manner. Even if it isn't a well-known case of a sin that's been committed, that I believe is how we are to handle that, and then sit down and discuss righteously, but not to, as we made the point, not to hang the elder because he's done something that we shouldn't do, something in our daily lives. There's all kinds of situations where that can arise. So Jeff?
One thing we learned from looking at the widows and the conduct of the church, and now with the elders, is that the church is supposed to make judgments about things. We are supposed to examine things.
Right.
And examine conduct. We do it with humility, but it
Right.
has to be done with courage. That's not always a very easy thing to do, and that's why things get swept under the rug or avoided, because it's difficult and uncomfortable. God calls us to do it. We can't say, well, you to judge me. Well, God says we are to make judgments. That the church remain pure.
Yeah.
Correct us.
Exactly.
But the aim is always to correct it, not to hurt anyone, it's to correct it.
Right. We forget maybe our goal. It's easier to avoid. I agree, to sweep it under the rug. We don't want to hurt feelings. I think a minor thing is I went through one time on lottery tickets, and someone told me that they buy them all the time. So I had to tell them what I thought and what I believed the Bible thought. But, wow, it really made hard feelings. But I thought, well, but if you amplify that to the position of the elders, really we need to remind ourselves what our goal is. God's not going to accept it. So shouldn't we be reminding ourselves of that? Because then we're going to miss out on our eternal reward.
You would think with an elder, that's not always the case, but you would hope that if there really is a problem and it is pointed out to them, that they will correct it.
Right.
That's the type of person that should be appointed as an elder. We recognize that they are not perfect, that they can make mistakes, and you would hope in a situation it would not come to where the church has to make those types of judgments, because the elder will correct himself.
Right.
And you would hope that. That's not always the case, but you would hope that.
No, that's true.
If there really is a problem.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's why God gave so many qualifications for them. To look after a congregation and all the problems that arise, that is a big duty and a big challenge. And understandably, why God made so many qualifications for that. Because somebody that's a time bomb or not going to do very good trying to settle disputes if you're ready to explode and not reason and think clearly. Okay, well, no other thoughts on that. I think we got a few minutes. We'll see how far we can get through. Now we'll look at the evangelists.
Come to me.
So we'll pick on Jared now for a while. But according to Dave's question here, according to the following passages, what are the responsibilities which the evangelist is charged? And we have, I didn't put these verses up on slide. And I did think also too, you know, as we look at this, passages on the evangelist, we need to remember that publicly our role might not be that. We may not be receiving an income for that, but aren't we all, that's what I took from a lot of these verses, aren't we all to be evangelists? You know, and so a lot of these things that Paul says here apply also to us as Christians. Sure.
I treat it sort of as deacons. We're all servants.
Right.
We're all to be servants, but there are some who are called to be deacons who meet those qualifications. Well, we're all to be preachers of the gospel, but there are those who will devote their lives to it. And Timothy was one of them.
Right. So verses, when do we quit? At 1:45?
1:45, you get the bell in 3 minutes.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll do 1 Timothy 1 and verses 3 and 4. Where did we end? Menchie, do you want to read that, please?
Not given to wine, no striker, not greedy or filther, but patient, not a brawler, not covetous. One that rules well his own house, having his children in subjection with all God.
Chapter 1.
I gave you the wrong one. 1 Timothy 1, verses 3 and 4. First Timothy 1.
You're in chapter 3.
Chapter 1.
As I besought thee to abide still in Ephesus, when I went into Macedonia, that thou mightest charge some that they teach no other doctrine, neither give heed to fables and endless genealogies, which minister questions rather than godly edifying, which is in faith. So do.
Okay, thank you. Way maybe to open our thoughts here, remind us then, is just as surely as physical food determines how our physical bodies are looked after, that is exactly the same analogy we can use for the church as a family. We know the elders are to feed the flock, but what is the duty of an evangelist when you read these, especially verse 4? What would happen to a church? What would happen to our group if Jeremy goes on with fables and endless genealogies? What is Paul trying to have us see there?
It's going to cause division, dispute, and it's not going to grow people's faith.
Right, Jared. It's going to do us no good, is it? We're certainly not going to grow. And so then the evangelist, Timothy, is being charged here to give no time to that, to spend your time only with the truth, and that the truth is the only thing that will preserve the security of the church. And so that's a charge to him. Individually, we can say these are the same with us, but the evangelist is in that position to uphold that. Well, I don't think we're going to get through the rest of them, so maybe we'll leave these.
Yeah, actually,
Verse,
just before that bell goes, that they teach no other doctrine. That tells us that there was doctrine that Timothy had been taught. Sometimes we say, well, the New Testament hadn't been written. By the time First Timothy was written, a lot of the New Testament had been written. This is later in Paul's life. He had written a lot of his epistles, but he had taught prophetically. Timothy and these churches, there was doctrine and teaching, and Timothy was to not teach something Paul hadn't revealed to him, because that would lead him away.
Right, right. And Paul makes that point, doesn't he, that he was chosen of God, and the things that you have heard from me, Timothy was to teach.
I'm not ashamed to hold my Lord, nor